Hey, is we good? Can we start?
Yep, anytime you're ready.
So I want to welcome you all to Governmental Studies Lunch. My name is Ben Ginsberg. I chair Governmental Studies at Hopkins. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have as our speaker today Naomi Schaefer Riley, who is a very well-known and distinguished journalist and writer. Naomi has written for many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Post, the Weekly Standard, too many to list. And she's also the author, I think, of 6 books, with a 7th on its way. I actually went to graduate school with Naomi's father, which tells you how old I am. He was a little ahead of me. And I first met Naomi when we debated one another for the New York Times Blogging Heads series. She wrote a book entitled The Faculty Lounges, which was an attack on the tenure system, which I thought was utterly outrageous. I had written a book called Fall of the Faculty, which, among other things, defended the tenure system. So we had good fun debating that entire set of questions. I'm very confident that I won, but I have to confess that Naomi acquitted herself very, very, very well. Her most recent book deals with a topic that most of us don't know much about, and that is the utterly shameful condition of America's Indian reservations and the utterly shameful treatment that Native Americans receive from the federal government. Naomi has very, very properly entitled the book The New Trail of Tears. And when she tells the story, you'll see why this is such a fitting title, and why the story that she has to tell is so important. So Naomi, please come forward.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you all for coming out today. It appears as though Ben won the argument because he's still teaching here, so he has that going for it. Well, I usually offer a kind of a warning before I give a talk about this subject, not the kind of safe space warning you may be used to, but just sort of a warning that you might want to go get something stiffer to drink because this is a thoroughly depressing topic and I don't have a lot of good news for you today. Well, with that, I'll begin. About 3,000 people live in Manderson, South Dakota. Manderson is in the middle of the Pine Ridge Reservation, which makes up most of the second poorest county in the United States. In 2013, the 5 police officers assigned to patrol the area received 16,500 calls for emergency assistance. Now, I want to take a minute for all of you to do the math. 3,000 people, 16,500 calls, 5 police officers. As of 2009, there were 39 gangs on the Pine Ridge Reservation involving more than 5,000 young men. The average life expectancy for men on the reservation is 48. Pine Ridge is one of the worst reservations, but the nationwide statistics, I'm afraid, are not much better. American Indians have the highest rate of poverty of any racial group in the nation. High school graduation is around 50% and has actually fallen in recent years. Suicide is the leading cause of death for Native American males aged 10 to 14. Alcohol use disorders are more likely among American Indian youths than those belonging to any other racial group. Involvement in gang activity is more prevalent among Native Americans than it is among Latinos and African Americans. Native American women report being raped at 2.5 times the national average. The rate of child abuse among Native Americans is twice as high as the national average. An estimated 1 out of every 4 girls and 1 out of every 6 boys in Indian country is molested before the age of 18. If you want to understand what is behind these statistics, you have to visit Indian territories. And a couple of years ago, that's exactly what I did. I spent some time visiting the elementary school in Manderson. It's called Wounded Knee, and it has received recently $600,000 in turnaround funds from the federal government. It is clean, freshly painted, and mostly quiet in the halls. They have installed a computer room to reward kids for good behavior and laundry machines so that local parents will have an incentive to come meet with teachers. Academically, though, it's pretty appalling. As I stood there, the principal, Alice Phelps, offered to help a second-grade student with 2 math problems. She gave the boy incorrect answers to both of them. Phelps had recently fired the entire staff of the school and rehired only those teachers who had not come from Teach for America. Despite the fact that some had math degrees from the best colleges in the country, Phelps felt they were not the right fit. Other tribal leaders were much more explicit. They told me the TFA folks were simply too white. But in Manderson, it must be said, the school's first job is just to keep children safe. Phelps occasionally called the police when students got violent, but mostly their problems are not serious enough to merit an officer's response. So the school has learned how to handle matters on its own. Quote, "One weekend a month, we have lock-in," Phelps tells me. Lock-in, I asked, wondering what these innocent-looking kids had done to deserve such a punishment. Lock-in is not punishment, she assured me. It's when children stay at school all weekend for their safety. Although the weekend is billed as a cultural enrichment event for the children, they sing songs and play traditional games in the school's gym. Phelps tells me that it's timed, actually, to coincide with when the government checks go out. These are the times when parents are most likely to drink and become abusive, she says. The rhythm of life at Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge, and for the over 1 million American Indians living on reservations, is surprisingly dependent on the federal government. To know just how much the economy on the reservation depends on public funds, one need only look at the effects that the federal government shutdown had in the fall of 2013 on the reservations. Take the Crow tribe. Some 364 Crow members, more than a third of the tribe's workforce, were furloughed. A bus service, the only way some Crows are able to actually travel across their 2.3 million acre reservation, was shuttered. A home health care aid for sick tribal members was suspended. The Yurok tribe in Northern California relies almost solely on federal financing to operate. Its reservation has an unemployment rate of 80%. When I wrote this recently in an op-ed, an editor wrote me back saying, "You must mean that the employment rate is 80%. And I assured her that no, I meant the unemployment rate. As a result of the shutdown, the tribe furloughed 60 of its 310 employees, closed its child care center, and halted emergency financial assistance to low-income and older members. Financing for a program that ensures clean drinking water on the reservation ran low. These tribes are so dependent on the federal government that without money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, their economic activity comes to a complete halt, and their members may not have access to clean drinking water. This is a third world country that exists in the middle of the wealthiest nation on earth. The question is, how did we get here? Reservations, most people know, were formed as a way to get Indians out of the way, to push natives onto infertile or otherwise undesirable plots of land so that Americans could pursue westward expansion. Today, though, a surprising number of people seem to view reservations as a way of protecting Native Americans, of ensuring that no one can take anything away from them. Reservation land is held, quote, in trust for Indians by the federal government. The only other people we legally hold things in trust for are children or the mentally incompetent. The goal of this policy originally was to keep Indians contained, but now it has shifted to preserving these lands for indigenous peoples. But the effect is the same. Indians can't own reservation land. No one on a reservation can get a mortgage because the property on the reservation is held in trust by the federal government. Most of it is also, quote unquote, owned communally by the tribe. A bank could never foreclose on a property because the bank cannot own reservation land. Despite millions of acres of empty space, there is a severe housing shortage on many reservations. More and more families crowd into small trailer homes. I visited a tribal college on one of these reservations, and they were talking to me about the possibility of expansion. And they said, we'll have to build up. And I looked out the window at acres upon acres of empty space, and they explained that they could never get a loan to build on that because that's land that they don't already have in their quote-unquote possession. So they're thinking about building and space the way people do in New York City as opposed to the way people do or should in Montana. But this is only part of the problem. More than a quarter of small business owners in the U.S. use home equity loans in order to start up a business or finance an existing one. But American Indians do not have access to that capital. They don't own their land, so they don't own their homes, so they can't use their homes as equity. Indians have long suffered from what Nobel Prize-winning economist Hernando de Soto has called dead capital. They may possess a certain amount of land on paper, but they can't put it to use by selling it, buying more to take advantage of economies of scale, or borrowing against it. Indian reservations may have been thought to be useless land once, but that is no longer the case. In fact, they contain almost 30% of the nation's coal reserves west of the Mississippi, 50% of potential uranium reserves, and 20% of known oil and gas reserves. These resources are worth nearly $1.5 trillion, or $290,000 per tribal member. Tragically, 86% of Indian lands with energy or mineral remain undeveloped because of the federal control of reservations. In order to tap those reserves, Indians must follow a 49-step process, as one Crow legislator explained to me. These steps involve the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, and the Commerce Department, and it can take months, if not years, for each step to be approved. Just to dig a hole requires a $6,500 upfront payment for an application for a permit to drill. Compare that to the process just off the reservation, which requires about $125 and 5 steps. The bureaucracy that oversees reservations is mind-boggling. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has a total of 9,000 employees. That's 1 employee for every 111 Indians on a reservation. And as with all bureaucrats, they need to find something to do. One Indian man I spoke to was trying to purchase a few acres of land from his neighbor, another Indian, on which to graze a few cattle. The 2 men had agreed on a price, but then a representative of the Bureau of Indian Affairs told them the deal couldn't go through because the price they had agreed on was not, quote, fair market value. In the real world, of course, fair market value is what someone would actually pay you for the land, but not in the world of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The agency, it turned out, had recently commissioned an appraisal of the land on the reservation and apparently had told the appraiser to overvalue the land so as, quote, not to screw the Indians. Which is, of course, exactly what happened. It's no wonder Indians say that BIA stands for bossing Indians around. But what about the casinos? I am regularly asked, can't Indians make enough money from gambling to claw their way out of poverty? Most Indian casinos, those of us in the Northeast don't see, are dinky affairs in isolated communities, and their customers are other Indians. But even the successful casinos don't bring the kind of prosperity that you might expect. The Senecas in upstate New York have made over $1 billion on their gaming operations. Those profits are distributed to tribe members in the form of annuities. According to Lucille Brooks, who runs the Seneca Economic Development Company, quote, these annuities have created an entitlement attitude, and that is the downfall. The annuities have enabled people not to work. Now that more and more states are opening up gambling to non-Indians, tribes are facing increased competition. The Seneca Nation has offered low or no interest loans to anyone who wants to try to start some other business, but there are almost no takers. Michael John, who is the manager there of the Small Business Incubator program on the territory, said his group actually conducted a survey to find out which businesses residents should open. He tells people that there are too many pizza places around, and instead he recommends outdoor recreation, maintenance, landscaping, and professional massage. You don't have to go to Beijing to see central planning at work. The economic outlook on the reservations is bleak. Indians have no real property, no access to capital for building businesses, little ability to develop their own natural resources, and no incentive to work. We give them regulatory and tax advantages in things like gaming, alcohol, tobacco, and even marijuana. industries that none of us would want in our backyards. But even those don't help them because the industries are all collectively owned by the tribes, and the profits are distributed like lottery winnings or welfare checks, depending on your perspective. More money is plainly not the answer here. Washington sends about $20 billion a year to reservations. The Indian Health Service, for instance, has a budget in 2015 of $4.6 billion. It is perhaps the last place in the country you would want to see a doctor. The Bureau of Indian Education spends about $20,000 per pupil compared to a national average of $12,400. Not only did the schools fail to educate students, but even their roofs are caving in. The BIE has gone through 33 directors in 36 years. And more cultural sensitivity is unlikely to do the trick either. After the media launched a national campaign to get the owner of the Washington Redskins to change his team's name, the Washington Post did a survey and found that 9 in 10 Indians couldn't care less about the name of the team. Which is not surprising. If your community is facing an epidemic of adolescent suicide, would NFL mascots be at the top of your list of concerns? The tragedy of American Indian policies demands immediate examination, not only because they make the lives of millions of American citizens harder and more dangerous, but also because they are a microcosm of everything that has gone wrong with modern liberalism. They're the result of decades of politicians and bureaucrats showering a victimized people with money and sensitivity instead of what they truly need: the autonomy, the education, and the legal protections to improve their own situations. American Indians, like all Americans, must be able to avail themselves of the economic and legal freedoms that this country guarantees. Until that, they will remain mired in poverty, social pathology, and the kind of anger that comes from knowing that your fate is controlled by an ineffective and ill-informed bureaucracy. The solutions here are not easy, but they could start with education. The states that have the largest Indian populations are also some of the only ones that have no charter laws. These children have no alternatives to places like Wounded Knee because no one is allowed to offer one. We could start to scale back some of the regulation in Washington, allowing Indians to develop natural resources without having to pass everything through the BIA. And some legislators are working to curb the power of that agency. But ultimately, it will be hard to undo this economic disaster without real property rights. A number of tribes in Canada are actually pushing legislation called the First Nations Property Ownership Act, which would create the legal framework for individual members of First Nations to access capital through secure property rights. They see reserve land, which is treated similarly to our reservations here, as becoming more like cities. Even if the land were sold, it would still remain part of the city, just as no one can sell a part of New York City to Newark. But individuals of any race would be able to buy and sell it among themselves without the permission of or the oversight of tribal or federal officials. This would allow for a true free market. First Nation members who wanted to lease their land for the development of natural resources would be able to do so without seeking permission from the national government, and those who wanted to sell their property would be able to select the highest bidder, regardless of race, take that money, and put it to use for themselves and for their families. Finally, those who wanted to keep their land would be able to borrow against it to build a home or start a business. As one Lumbee Indian from North Carolina told me, quote, "The only solution I see is divide everything up and give it to the Native American family and let them disperse it, spend it, keep it, whatever. I don't need no government taking care of me." This kind of freedom, he says, that's why the Pilgrims left Europe. Thank you very much. Should I just take questions?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I assume you interviewed BIA officials as well. What do they have to say for themselves?
Well, I did not interview a lot of BIA officials because most of the research I was doing was really on the ground at the reservations. The BIA is actually made up 75% of Native Americans. It's not, I think a lot of people misunderstand it as some kind of sort of a white paternalist bureaucracy that's just imposing its will. But I think that they see their job as essentially the way a lot of people see reservations now, which is the last best hope for protecting the rights of American Indians. And, just as I think many bureaucrats in Washington see regulations as a way of protecting the people who are at the heart of them, so it's not much different with the BIA. But when you talk to people on the ground about the way that these regulations are interfering with their day-to-day lives and any kind of even small form of commerce that they may engage in, the results are much different from the intention.
So I'm a little curious to know what some of the advantages are to Native Americans actually living on these reservations versus sort of integrating within other urban societies or whatnot. And also if the rights of, what are the differences between the rights of American Indians versus all Americans? Like what would be the advantage of actually staying there versus integrating otherwise?
So, one question I get a lot, I don't know if this is one thing that you want to know, but is why don't they leave? That's kind of at the heart of this question. And I think there are several reasons behind that. The first is just, we kind of naturally, I think we grow up in a place and, it's home and we know it is home. And I think that may be more the case on some of these reservations because there's such an extreme sense of isolation. Some of these reservations, you fly to Rapid City, South Dakota, and then drive 100 miles. There is nothing around. Your GPS doesn't work. Your cell phone might not work. And I think and this is one of the things that I was just noticing because I've done a lot of research on, families who live in inner cities. One of the differences between rural and urban poverty is I think in an urban setting, in the South Bronx, for instance, chances are if you're a child, you see people in the middle class who get onto the subway every day and go to jobs. If you are living on the Pine Ridge Reservation, you may not have anyone in your immediate family with any kind of employment. You may not have anyone in your immediate family who is not have a problem with drug or alcohol use. You may not have anybody who has a high school education. There are all of these aspects of life that seem normal to most middle-class Americans that would seem like life on another planet to some of the people living in these communities. So I think the isolation is definitely one part of it. In terms of the advantages, I think, it's not as if the people who are living on these reservations would immediately say move to Rapid City and find themselves, rolling in dough. There would be, even if you had the wherewithal to leave the reservation, you would still be, for instance, coming at it with an inferior education. So you would be trying to, get yourself into a workforce, and obviously there'd be more opportunities for employment, but you may not be, very qualified for any of those opportunities because of the disadvantages you've had up until that point. In terms of what rights, that's a kind of an interesting question. There are many Americans who don't realize American Indians are American citizens. That is kind of a fundamental thing that when I go around talking to audiences, I think some of the talk that you hear about tribal sovereignty actually has this impact on its audience where they think, wait, are you like a citizen of another country? Are you really part of the United States? American Indians are American citizens, and so as such, they should have all of these rights. In fact, when you look at it, and I didn't get into this too much because this was mostly about the economics, but the book gets into all these questions about what the actual rights are that they're being denied. So, for instance, freedom of the press on some of these reservations is severely restricted. If the tribe does not like what a local newspaper has written about some tribal law that has been passed or something that they've said about tribal legislators, they will ban or could ban the newspaper from being sold anywhere on the reservation. There have been, and there was just a Supreme Court case this year about the rights of people in tribal court. And there is a question about, whether you have been granted due process in a tribal court. The Association for Defense Lawyers in the United States has actually written several letters to Congress complaining that people who have been accused in certain kinds of cases have not been granted the right to a lawyer, have not been granted the right to a speedy trial. All of these things that we take for granted in the rest of the courts in the United States, as a resident of an Indian territory, you might be denied. And I think the biggest question, I'm sorry to go on so long with your answer, but I think for me one of the biggest questions about the rights being denied to Indians has to do with the Indian Child Welfare Act that you may be familiar with, which actually gives tribes a say in custodial battles over children. So in cases of divorce, in cases of the death of parents, even in cases where an Indian woman might get pregnant and she might want to give her child, up for adoption to another family, a tribe could come in and say, if you are a child who has, a drop of Indian blood essentially in you, the tribe could say, no, we don't think that you should be raised by white family members. No, we don't think that a pregnant mother should be able to give up her child for adoption to a white family. So a lot of these decisions are being made differently for Indian children than they are for children of any other race. They're not being, the cases are not being decided in the best interest of the child, which is, of course, the standard for any other case. They're being decided as what are in the best interests of the tribe. So those are some of the rights that I think are really being, aside from the economic rights that I was talking about, the economic freedoms, those are some of the rights that American citizens have that a lot of American Indians, unfortunately, do not.
Have you noticed that the directors and officials in the BIA, is there a correlation for how long they have not lived or resided on a reservation and how often they go back to find out how the policies and regulations are actually playing out on the reserved land versus those that remain and might try to be politically involved?
I have not studied that. I don't know. I do know that there are BIA officials who certainly have contact with people on the reservation, or there are BIA officials who live on the reservation. I think the other thing that you get aside from this answer about how these policies are offered with the best of intentions, about how these regulations are being promulgated in the best interests of Indians, is this question about money. And I think the line that you certainly hear from the leadership of the tribes, and sometimes from BIA officials too, is that they're underfunded. It is a question of, if only we had another grant program, another federal allocation, whether it's for housing or for schools or for health programs, then we would be able to fix all of this. And increasingly, what was interesting was, as I talked to American Indians on the reservations, particularly those who were older, I felt like they had heard this line a lot over the years, and they had always felt like the next program around the bend was going to be the one that saved them. And they had become quite cynical about that possibility because they had seen the money come, and either there is a great deal of corruption on these reservations, the money had not gone to where it was promised, or the money had gone to where it was promised, but it hadn't spurred the kind of economic growth, the kind of educational quality, the kinds of things that were promised. And I think that overall, especially, again, the older Indians on the reservation had felt like that line had been played out.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the ideological divide, or what their perceptions are, because as America has become much more multicultural, and we have children who are in public schools who are really taught, about the oppression of Native Americans, and you mentioned the hand-wringing we do over mascot names and things like that. Do they have a perception, given what you said about the Teach for America workers who are not allowed to teach, that there's this whiteness to America, that they will not be welcomed if they do seek to assimilate? I mean, aside from the economic disincentives, but is there a perception that we are not a multicultural society? Are they, oblivious to that?
Some of these reservations are multicultural themselves. I mean, there is plenty of intermarriage going on with people just outside the reservation. It's very rare, to find, somebody who doesn't have, what they would call mixed blood. That my father was white, my mother was Indian. They met at some farm dance or something. I mean, it's certainly not an uncommon story. So I don't think that they believe America is this vast white universe where they would not be welcomed. But certainly, I think the pervasive positive message on the reservations, the one that they're getting from tribal leaders and in many cases from schools, is one of victimization. It's one where the problems that we are experiencing here, can be blamed on prejudice, can be blamed on things that are outside of our control. And as I said, I mean, some of these policies certainly are outside of their control. And I actually was kind of torn when, trying to figure out who was the audience for this book, because, in some ways you want to go to Washington, you want to change these policies, but, these are people who you want to give more autonomy, more control. But the point of changing these policies would be to get more freedom back to them and to help them see themselves less as victims, because more of this power would reside there. Even on the tribal level, I mean, I mentioned this in passing, this question of the Teach for America folks being too white. It's shocking how often this accusation is thrown around by tribal officials. I was at the Red Cloud Indian School, which is a Catholic school on Pine Ridge, and there's another one called the St. Lebre School, which is on in between the Northern Cheyenne and the Crow Reservation in Montana. Both these schools are really, they're the only good thing around. I mean, they're offering kids a decent education. They actually send quite a few kids to college each year. They have standards, and they are providing kids with so much. They will provide you with after-school tutoring. One of the schools will, actually both schools will provide you with free boarding. There's no tuition that's required. It's all outside donations that are making these schools operate. And, if you talk to the leaders of the tribes where these schools are, you get nothing but insults about these schools. Oh, they're creaming the best of our students. This is just a legacy of the boarding schools. And certainly the boarding school question is something that you hear a lot about. In almost all problems, I think, on the reservations, you will hear at some point someone talk about the boarding school, whether it's alcoholism or the sexual abuse that goes on, economic problems. And I think that, what's interesting is the lengths to which, especially these two schools, certainly that I visited, have gone to try to make up for that legacy. Both of these schools are completely run by American Indians. There is not a white person in the administration of these schools. So there's, the person who runs the St. Lebre School is half Crow, half Northern Cheyenne. Almost all the teachers are Native Americans. They will bring in, people from the Jesuit Volunteer Corps to come help out, and because there are not a lot of qualified teachers on the reservation. I mean, this woman who went and fired half her staff, her whole staff at her elementary school, what she did was she went and hired teachers from another local elementary school, which now has a teaching shortage. I mean, in any fall, on Pine Ridge, there are typically classrooms, about 40, 50 classrooms that have no teachers at the front of them. So the idea that, you can just sort of say, oh, I like you, you're white, you're too white, I won't have you. I mean, these kids need some kind of quality. They need some kind of, educated adult at the front of that room offering them some tools for the future. And, the kinds of objections you hear, I think, would be deeply worrisome to parents who are on the reservation who want something better for their kids.
You mentioned a property scheme in Canada, and so I was just wondering, I don't know that much about the Canadian situation, but how does the situation of Indians in Canada differ? As far as from what I understand, they face similar problems, but obviously with different policies in place. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit to that comparative aspect.
Sure. So the reserve system is very similar to our reservation system in the sense that they don't have these property rights. What's different is that Indigenous people in Canada have a lot more political power. In part, it's because they make up a slightly greater portion of the population, but it's actually how the population is concentrated, particularly in areas like British Columbia, where they would have a great deal of say over provincial policies. and Indians might make up a similar proportion of the population in, Montana or, or South Dakota, but those are only, of course, one of 50 states that we have. So they're not going to have the same degree of influence. That it's interesting because that policy, certainly got a lot. They've had a lot of pushback from other First Nations leaders on that proposal. But I think what's so attractive to me and to many Indians about that proposal is it actually is an opt-in law. So if you're a tribe that really wants property rights, that is ready for this, that feels like you don't have enough autonomy, you can opt into this First Nations Property Ownership Act. If you are a tribe that feels like you're being protected by the state and feels like the last thing standing between you and white people taking over your land tomorrow is the reserve system, you can keep it. I mean, yes, if you like your land, you can keep it. So I think that they have actually managed to reassure a lot of First Nations leaders by saying, look, this is an option. And I think a lot of First Nations leaders have signed on because they have been experiencing this frustration for so many years. They certainly have similar natural resource questions there, especially in British Columbia, which is rich with natural resources. One of the places I visited is called Kamloops, and it's so interesting there, the stark contrast that you see on one side of the Kamloops River from the other. I compare it, it's a little bit extreme, but it's sort of the North Korea, South Korea difference, because if you look at it at night, you see almost no lights on the reserve side of the river because there's no development. There are the homes there are almost all temporary. Again, because of this land question, you can't get a mortgage to build a house. You can just get a trailer home that you can stuff more and more of your family members into. So despite the fact that this area is not only rich with natural resources, but it's gorgeous and tourists are flocking in and out of it all the time, and the side of the river that is not reserve land is flourishing, while you go to the other side and you see everything is falling apart. And it's also really, I think, just an amazing lesson in what ownership means. I mean, the average lifespan for even a real house on the reserve side of the river, is something like 15 years. That's the point at which someone will need to tear it down and build a new house because it has been so badly taken care of. One of the things that, just one more point on the Canadian question, they've tried to get around this mortgage question a little bit by having the tribes back the mortgages. So they'll say, well, if you fail to pay the bank, we promise the bank as the tribe to pay millions of dollars a year, in arrears that the tribes are having to pay because their members say, oh, this is your problem. You owe this to us. We don't actually have to pay that money. And by the way, and this has happened in the United States too, by the way, if you make us try to pay this money, we will simply vote you out of office. So you can see how all of the incentives are so perverted in this system. Nobody has a pride of ownership. Nobody has a sense that this is a long-term asset that they can keep. Everybody has the sense that this is somebody else's responsibility.
You mentioned at the beginning the high rates of sexual violence happening in a lot of the tribes. I would just interested if you could maybe expand on that some, maybe talk about the tribal court system and if you think that impacts those rates.
Right. So I do think, the explanation about boarding schools seems as reasonable as any to me in terms of getting at what the root cause is here. I mean, you did have schools, some that were run by the state, but some that were run by the Catholic Church and other churches, where there was widespread kind of sexual abuse, and then you had these kids who were coming back to the reservation as adults who were clearly had huge emotional problems and not didn't understand the sexuality, didn't understand their role in the family, and the result was, I think, they sort of ended up perpetrating this on their own children. But what about now? And that's sort of the question I keep coming back to with people, because this is not a problem now. I mean, this is the sexual abuse on reservations are a problem. The boarding schools are not the issue now. So the question is how to move forward. Unfortunately, we have had a situation where we are not properly protecting the rights of women who are victims of sexual violence and children who are victims of sexual abuse. The United States federal government. This is one of the cases where I do think there is an enormous role for the federal government to be overseeing this, because these are American citizens who need to be protected. And so, for instance, you have cases where the tribal court system, they're not collecting rape kits properly, or they're not doing it at all. You have cases where judges are presiding over cases in which their own family members are parties to them. You have cases, again, even where the defendants are not properly being given their rights. The rules of evidence are different. So on a court level, I think there is a huge problem. And then beyond that, we've had a couple of cases where whistleblowers, people who have said, who have worked for the United States federal government, who have said, a lot of this is being swept under the carpet. I mean, you have the cases at Spirit Lake, for instance, is the one that has made the news most, where it's just widespread what is going on. And one of the people who, said we have to make this public, we have to do something else about this, was fired from his job for saying that out loud. So I think sometimes the impulse toward, being sensitive, I mean, nobody wants to say there's widespread sexual abuse on Indian reservations, especially if you feel like, well, the real problem was the boarding schools and that was sort of the original sin. But we have to say it, and it's not on every reservation. But I think we have to think about the children who are the victims here. And, it's not a question of who we can blame 50 years ago. It's a question of how we can move forward. And the only way to do so, I think, is really by holding the perpetrators accountable and making sure that not only are they subject to tribal courts, whatever, kind of justice they're meting out, but making sure that they're subject to the same laws that other Americans are subject to.
I have a question about how to move forward. I mean, you've described this horrendous state of affairs. It sounds like a cross between a broken down welfare state and the Gulag. What prevents the adoption of new policies? Who defends what we have now? Is it the agency? Is it the tribal governments?
Who defends what we have now is most people. I think the system we have in place right now is a kind of partnership, a kind of perverse partnership that exists between the tribal leadership and representatives in Washington. And the tribal leadership says to the people living on the reservation, you go vote for X, Y, and Z representative. They will bring home more money to us, and we promise to fix your problems with that more money. And I think the people in Washington who represent, the congressmen who are from these districts, have no incentive to say, we have to put a stop to this. There's too much corruption. There are too many problems in Indian country. They're not protecting people's rights, because they want to be reelected. And then, there's the rest of Congress. And what do they care? I mean, I'm just not just saying that flippantly, but if you are, a representative to Washington from Rhode Island or from Connecticut, what is your incentive to go in there and launch a crusade about the corruption on Indian reservations or about getting Indians more property rights? You don't see that as your job. So I think that, again, the incentives are wrong here. The things that could be done, like I said sort of at the end, from my perspective, the lowest hanging fruit here are problems that could be fixed on the state level. I think that honestly, with enough, with enough push, I think you could see the adoption of educational alternatives in states like South Dakota or Montana. One quick anecdote: when I interviewed some parents on Pine Ridge, and a few of them had recently gone on a plane trip, care of an outside philanthropist, to go see KIPP charter schools in Denver. And the parents who were on this plane came back, and they were blown away. they saw these schools that were actually, they're high-performing charter schools. They're teaching kids. The father who I was talking to said, the kids there didn't even speak English at first. We're ahead of them. At least we already speak English. But, it was a little bit of what I was saying before, exposing them to what other options are. Because, again, this kind of isolation gives you the sense that this is all there is, that anything else is beyond your reach. And so, to give them a sense of, if you did push for charter school legislation in South Dakota, you could actually get a KIPP to open just off the reservation. You could get educational alternatives to exist off the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana. And it wouldn't be everything. It certainly wouldn't solve property rights, but at least it would give your kids the kind of knowledge that they need to take the next steps on behalf of your people. And right now, they just don't have those tools. And with each succeeding generation, as I said, the graduation rate, high school graduation rate for Indians is 50%. It's been falling. I mean, we are sending more money. We are sending billions upon billions of dollars to help Indian education, and it's doing nothing. And so you see with each succeeding generation, the failure is compounding itself. To start with, I think that would be the lowest hanging fruit. The problems with changing these policies are so deeply ingrained in in constitutional law at this point that it is very hard to untangle the property rights issue. But I don't see any way around it. I mean, you're getting this question right now, and many of you have been following the North Dakota pipeline issue. Federal law currently says that those treaties that people keep mentioning are not valid. I mean, we can like that, or we don't have to like that, but that's the bottom line. I mean, we have sort of, the federal government has said there have been Supreme Court cases that have said Indian treaties that were signed in the 19th century are meaningless. They don't have to dictate our current policy today. But we're still having this argument over something, or a treaty that was signed in 1858, and the problem is that we can't move beyond that. We can't. So instead of having an argument about taking the land that is reservation land, giving it to people so that they can start lifting themselves up, so they can start having the same economic freedoms and opportunities that the rest of us already have. Instead of doing that, we are stuck arguing about these things that happened 150 years ago. And I don't see, that's not going anywhere. It's not helping anyone. And so I understand why it's not, people don't want to hear that, and it does seem deeply unfair. It seems unfair that we have taken this land, but this is where a federal policy stands right now. And so I see it the same way I see the boarding school questions. What are we going to do next? Because what we are doing has not been working, and it's been making the lives of American Indians worse and worse with each succeeding generation. It's not getting better.
Just following up on that, so who are the champions in Congress? When you mentioned, at least I thought you were saying there's some traction for the property rights piece of this? So
there are some folks in the Utah delegation, which Utah has some American Indians, and they have been trying, for instance, to pass legislation that would curb some of the BIA's powers, particularly when it comes to natural resources. Utah is right now engaged in this big fight over some land that the Obama administration wants to designate as a national monument, which would halt in many ways economic activity that is already happening there in order to preserve some cultural artifacts. But it's actually Indians on the ground who are engaged in that economic activity, and they have gone to their legislators and said, we don't want this to be, you should figure out a way to protect these cultural artifacts without designating this a national monument, because you're interfering with our ability to earn a livelihood. And so I think the representatives in Utah have really kind of gone to some lengths to try to figure out, how can we do this a different way, and also how can we make Indians as partners, in managing these natural resources in a much better way than we have, because the policies that we are enacting and that we are that Washington is defending are so deeply paternalistic. They, excuse me, they simply assume that Indians are not capable of doing this for themselves. And I think the research shows otherwise. I mean, there have been papers that have looked at when Indians have been put in charge of natural resources, on or nearby their land, or done it in partnership with the federal government, the results environmentally, the results for their people, the results economically turn out much better than when you just have some guy from the BIA saying this is how we're going to do things.
It sounds, obviously it's a very complex issue and issues and situation, but every time, as the policies are looked at, it's not just a matter of looking at the next generation to come and take, it's a multi-generational approach. And it needs to have the ultimate respect of how each individual people living on reserved land sees what they want the future to be, and not taking as blanket policies for all reserved land, because I also know you have lands in Oregon and Northern California that they're thriving in, like some forestry industries, and whereas you have on the plains in like Montana and South Dakota where they're struggling with these rights issues and what they can do even surrounding and on the reservations. So even when you talk about education, not just the current generation that's there in the schools, and that definitely needs to be addressed, but then how do you also educate the parents and giving them opportunities and seeing what opportunities and skills and talents they have, and the ultimate respect of the culture that has been completely disrespected, raped, and oppressed.
So I think this question comes up a lot, which is, how do you... It's actually a question that faces every racial or ethnic group in America. It's a question of how much are we Americans and how much are we Chinese and how much are we Jews and how much are we African Americans and this is the ultimate assimilation question in America. And I think American Indians face it in the same way. One response to that, though, has to be that the people who are most able to protect and secure their cultural heritage are those who have some kind of economic resource. If you are, a Korean family who moved here and you want your children to be able to speak Korean going forward, you will send them to Korean school. And they will learn their cultural heritage, and you will send them. You will go to a Korean church, and you will have, you will devote some of your resources that you earn from your job to preserving that cultural heritage. Unfortunately, some of the people we're talking about are just dealing with basic subsistence. And so sometimes when people ask me, well, aren't you concerned about the preservation of language, and aren't you concerned about the preservation of culture? I am, and I think that the best way to do that is to give American Indians the tools, the resources to do this themselves. One of the best programs that you see out there in preserving tribal language is actually at this Red Cloud Indian Catholic School. They're partnering with university researchers to record the way people speak in traditional languages so they can have all of this preserved for the future. They are teaching children. There's a whole curriculum of teaching the Lakota language to students at the school, and also to try to involve the community as much as possible. Fortunately, the school is dismissed as too white, so it doesn't count. But I think that when you're trying to figure out the best way to, again, give American Indians their autonomy. And this is what you're getting at, I think, with your question about how different tribes have different needs. Yes, if you gave each one of them their autonomy, and who's to say that the folks, the tribes that you're talking about in the Pacific Northwest wouldn't be doing even better, if they had more autonomy to make these decisions on their own? Because even though they're doing relatively well, they're still faced with the same kinds of regulatory obstacles that Indians on the plains are faced with. Even looking at the Senecas, I mentioned, $1 billion in gaming revenue. You would think that this place would look like Manhattan. And it doesn't, because in that time that they have gotten those revenues, the standard of living has improved a little bit. Their health care has gotten marginally better. They still go to some of the worst schools in New York State. And I said to the leaders of the tribe, I said, well, have you thought about opening your own school or trying to... They had, at one point, they had just talked about a partnership with a school in Buffalo, which is one of the top prep schools in the area. And the parents had said, oh, this is too hard for our kid. We're not interested. There was a local Catholic school that was doing a marginally better job of educating kids. And a lot of the parents said, no, it wasn't worth it to send their kids to the other side of the reservation for that. I said, well, have you given any of these resources to getting your kids a better education? Because, like I said, these are some of the worst schools in the state. And they said, well, we funded an additional 3 or 4 security officers at the local public school. To me, this is not a community that has been lifted up by this money. This is a community that, it's as if someone dropped a plane load full of dollar bills on this community, and no one has kind of picked it up and taken the initiative to make their lives better. And that's the difference between economic development that comes from, organically grown businesses with people who have an incentive to make their lives better, and dropping a plane load of money on people.
Just 2 things with that statement. One, I wouldn't compare other cultural groups that come from another country by choice to come to this land to live and try to make what they want and preserve their elements of their culture to a people that did not choose to be in the situation that they are in.
Why not?
Why not? Because the perception, the depression that comes with having your land stolen from you, that comes from trying to negotiate with a government that could care less about your being and your people, and that you basically lost and are continuously reminded of losing, whether it's treaties, policies, negotiations, pleading, is continuous re-traumatization of the person and the people. And so there are differences, because even when I'm hearing and I sit here and I'm listening to trying to find ways, which is why I went back to you, they have to be respected in such a way of what do they want, because the ways that a typical American or white American, which I understand that their statements of it's too white, they don't need to be told this is how you need to be living. This is what it takes to be successful, because some of the ways are just not even culturally sound to what some of them may want. It may be what some would want now, being with what they're learning. But everything is not.
I think that's actually terribly patronizing, because when I went to reservations, what I found was that people really wanted their children to get a high school education, and they really didn't like the level of poverty they were living in, and they really wanted material goods. No, a lot of this sort of, I think, devolves to this question of, well, what you culturally value is different from what I culturally value. And I don't think that's the case here. I think you're underestimating how much they would like to see the kind of success that other Americans have.
Definitely not underestimating, and what I'm saying is sometimes the how and the way differs, and it needs to be respected. I'm not saying what they have, what different people on reservations have going on now is what they are happy about. But my point is the change that they want to see and how they want to see it also needs to be respected, and it is key in that autonomy. So, for example, continually partnering with other schools. Like I wish I could remember the reservation off the top of my head, who actually is taking ownership of education, and they are also allowing in other the surrounding communities, and they are bringing in ways to preserve their culture and continue to educate their youth so they can of their people and of the surrounding communities. But they're doing it their way, and they're being successful at it. Not trying to take, say, a KIPP model, which, yeah, on some of these reservations, when they're saying it's too white, they're going to feel that way. Because it's very different to say, I can only succeed if the quote-unquote white man is telling me how to succeed, and this is the only way to do it, versus I have talent, I have skills that can be cultivated, and I have ideas to share, and
Right,
that
well,
they can
I
be
guess what
respected.
I guess we agree in some ways. I think that there are all sorts of different educational models that would allow American Indians to succeed. I think that the reason that I keep harping on the tribal leadership who tells me that it's too white is that it's only the tribal leadership who tells me it's too white. It's not the parents of these kids. They did not go to the KIPP school and say it's too white. They went to the KIPP school and said, wow, can I get that too? And to me, the answer should be yes. If that's what you want, absolutely. Let's bring it tomorrow. And I'm not suggesting that there is. I'm in favor of all kinds of educational choice, and whether we're talking about American Indians or not. But I think that their leadership sometimes is standing in the way of that. They're trying to act as a kind of cultural guard keeper, saying, no, this is what fits in our culture, and you, even though you're a full-blooded member of this tribe, cannot say what's in our culture because you don't know. I'm going to tell you what you should be preserving about your heritage, and I'm going to tell you what fits here. And I think that the parents who want something better for their children should have a much bigger say in how that turns out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a wonderful presentation, and you know, it resonates with work in other areas as well. I mean, Jen and I write about federal bureaucracy, and I think the bureaucrats downtown would like all of us on the reservation, where they could tell us what to do. So I think it's a piece of work whose importance goes beyond Indian nations, but it's very important that you focus on the dilemmas faced by Indians, because we are all responsible for it, and we don't want to look at it. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you all for coming. If there's more food, grab it. Thank you, that was great.